Hi and welcome back. Today's demonstration will be painting this beautiful Irish landscape of the Ring of Kerry, an amazing part of Ireland, I think in the southwest, with these beautiful trees and sky and distant mountains. My first step was just to very roughly put in the details in pencil of where my horizon, trees, mountain and foreground will be, just with very simple lines that will give me guidance for when I come to paint in a moment. It's worth practicing this kind of simplification from a photograph before you paint, so that you don't get hung up with too many details to start with. For loose painting, we're looking for just the basic impression of the scene in the photograph. Now I'm wetting the sky area all over with my large Chinese hake brush, and I'm going to start by mixing on my large Chinese calligraphy brush a little bit of raw sienna. I'm just going to splash that randomly across the sky just to start off a little bit of a glow for the clouds, because I want just a very grey cloudy sky, maybe with the kind of promise of a storm blowing in from the left. So the next thing I'm going to do is, with the same brush, just use Payne's grey, quite a thick rich mixture just at the top, and I'm just going to scrub it around across that sky area, leaving some paler gaps, leaving some of the raw sienna, and just trying to let the paint diffuse and soften, but keeping it as an interesting looking sky with those clouds blowing in from behind the mountains. There is a full 4-part tutorial for this over on Patreon, if you want to follow the link below in the description, where I showed every brush stroke of this, and it's a beginner's tutorial where even a beginner can put these stages together of painting and come up with quite a complex looking outcome at the end of putting all these stages together. But here I'm just sort of demonstrating the general principles of how I've gone about painting this scene and simplifying the photograph. Now I've just about got this wet in wet sky where I want it to be. It will lighten a little as it dries and soften back in places. My board is at an angle of about 45 degrees, so the paint is diffusing down with gravity. So I'm going to just mop up across the bottom, keeping it nice and light across the bottom, and then drawing that paint down just to put a bit of tone across the sea. Now I've just allowed that to dry, and I'm going to use the same colour, Payne's grey, a sort of a fairly weak mixture, but still with enough grey in it to match parts of the grey in the sky. I'm just going to use my flat brush to draw a long horizontal brush stroke along underneath the horizon, just to create that area of water simply and cleanly. Just going to dip into more paint and more water and fill in the area that I want to be water, using the horizontal strokes and using the tip of the brush just to add some sort of horizontal differentiations of line and tone in order to give the look of water. Now I think that's okay. Now I'm going to put in the mountain, And using the same sort of colour, because I want the mountains to be quite hazy and misty and just very, very faintly across the horizon as they are in the photograph. So I'm just using that similar colour of Payne's grey, and then I'm just going to soften across the bottom while the paint's wet, and so it should diffuse down to the horizon line and just meet the sea or the water area, the lake, whatever it is, I'm not sure, just to look like the misty distance. I'm just going to pull in this second hilly range in exactly the same way, putting it in with the flat brush and then softening back a little bit with the squirrel mop. I've put in, with slightly darker paint, a closer headland which will stick out from this rocky outcrop on the right. I've let that dry off again, and now I'm mixing up a very rich dark mixture of Payne's grey and sepia, and I'm going to paint in over the pencil marks that I put in for the trees. I'm using a small to medium calligraphy brush, a Chinese calligraphy brush. It's got a nice point, but if I apply even pressure, I can get a fairly good width of line that's quite even. And I'm just going to take these trees off at a slight angle, just off the page. Second tree will go in at a very slightly different angle. But this one's a little bit thicker, so I'm going to double up that line, that brush stroke, just to make the trunk a little bit wider for that one. I'm going to dip my brush into clean water and just touch it along the base of the wet paint on those tree trunks and just bring it down so that it softens off the base of the trees, and it will allow me to ground them into the landscape a little bit more easily when I come to paint the foreground. I'm just painting over my pencil marks again, just for this third tree trunk, leaning in even further, and I'm painting over the tape so that once that tape is removed, the trees will look as if they are leaning in from outside of the picture. I'll list all my materials in the description below so that you can see the colours that I used, the brushes and the paper and the angle of my board, etc. The details will always be below the video. Now this left-hand tree is slightly thinner, and I'm not going to take it off the page because this is a little bit further back and a smaller tree than these ones on the right. I'm going to swap now to my number 2 or number 3, I'm not sure, rigger brush, and using the same mixture of Payne's grey and sepia, I'm going to paint in a few branches just before I start putting on the canopies of these fir trees. I think they are pines of some sort. I don't want many of these branches, but I just want enough so that when I put the canopies in, you can just see you'll be able to see some of the branches supporting the canopy. Just a few little short stubby ones coming down off the trunk. And now some branches for these trees on the right, some sort of hangy downy ones. Coming down across the tape, just bringing them down, taking the pressure off the brush so that the brush strokes become a little bit finer towards the end of the branches. Put some of the branches coming from behind some of the trees. A lot of these will be covered up once I get the canopies on, but I'm just trying to create a bit of a framework, which again will guide me when I come to put the leaves on. I want these branches to be coming up in the opposite direction to those other branches, just to add a bit of variety to the shape, and also following the reference photograph. That's enough branches, I think, for now. So I'm going to leave them to dry so that I don't smudge them when I paint on my canopies. It's all dry again, so I'm now mixing up some perylene green. It's a lovely colour by Winsor & Newton, a nice dark blue green, and my favourite for foliage against these kinds of rugged grey skies. Now I'm using the tips and the corners of my small Pro Art hake brush to dot in and dash in the shape of these canopies. I'm looking at my reference photograph so I can roughly follow that. What I don't want to do is cover the whole area with sort of a blocky area of paint. That would not give me the look of these pine trees. So I'm trying to follow the direction of the branches and just dotting in the paint, making it darker in some places than in others, adding water and lightening some areas up, then going in with very rich paint, just to try and build up the right sort of shape for these pine trees. I want to make sure that I leave some of the branches exposed so you can see the shapes of the branches coming through like you can in the photograph. Now I'm going to do exactly the same across these trees on the right, nice and dark across the top. Again, following the lines of the branches, not covering the branches completely or evenly so that I leave some areas exposed, and then dot and dash for leaves and pine needles and things towards the ends of the branches. I'm being careful to maintain this kind of angle of leaning of the branches and trees leaning down into the picture, because I think it's this that attracted me. It's one of the things that attracted me to this photograph, was the way that the foliage is growing across the painting. Now I'm using a small calligraphy brush just to add some finer detail, little dots and dashes here and there to the ends of the branches, and just to break up some of the larger areas of foliage that I've painted in with the hake brush, just to add a little bit more texture and a little bit more detail. I'm just going to keep working like this until I like the look of the canopies, until I feel that they are sufficiently balanced to be able to then move on to the foreground. Now I think that will just about do. I've darkened up the top of this smaller tree, and now I'm just dotting in a tiny bit of foliage just across one of those lower branches. Now I'm taking my small hake brush again, the Pro Art one, and using my rich perylene green just to begin to paint the loose foreground. I'm following the lines that I penciled in again at the beginning of the painting, which is sort of the simplified version of the photograph. I'm trying to get this rocky outcrop at the top in the foreground on the right, and the slightly flatter but still rough ground across the edge of the lake. I'm using some long sweeping strokes with the brush, as well as dabbing around for some sort of scrubby detail. I'm keeping it very, very loose. Again, this is a loose painting, and I want to imply the foreground rather than overtly paint in every blade of grass or every rock. Now I'm darkening up some areas with Payne's grey, just strengthening up around the darker areas of perylene green, just to add to the rocks and the shadows. Some rocks in the distance there, and now I'm just going to dot in some raw sienna, a nice strong earthy colour, which will just help to make the greens and the greys pop a little bit more. Just fleshing out that rocky outcrop a little bit, loosely and roughly, with your fast, spontaneous brush strokes, just to try and get that loose look, sort of something in nothing, for the foreground. A simple sweep of dry brush across the front will just create the path without being too fussy or fiddly. And while the paint is still damp, I'm going to pull the corner of a plastic card through it to etch out just some sticks and twigs here and there loosely. I'll go in and do some more with the rigger a little bit later, but to start with I just want to pull through some of the paint just because it adds some really nice interesting textures. As the sharp corner etches through the paint, it can create some nice lines. And I think that's about all that I want to do to it now. I just need it to completely dry, and then I'll come back and finish it off. It's completely dry now, and looking at it, I think I need to balance up the painting a bit more and darken up the mountains. So I'm going to do that now with the flat brush and a medium mixture of Payne's grey and sepia. I don't want this to be too dark, but it needs to be a little bit darker just to balance up with the tones in the rest of the painting. So I'm just using the flat brush, thicker paint here and dotting in richer paint there, just to give a slightly uneven look to the mountain, trying to keep it a little bit softer near the base so I can maintain that misty, distant look. I think that looks better. Just while the paint's still wet, I'm going to drop just a few more little dark areas in, which should just gently diffuse out and just give a little bit more texture in the distance. And again, I'll just come in and soften back carefully with the squirrel mop, just to make sure I don't get too hard a edge across for that distant mountain range. My foreground has dried back quite a lot lighter, so now I'm just going to increase some of the contrast and tone in the foreground, just to suggest rocks and grasses growing in different wild ways around the edges of the path, and to bring out the shape of the rocky outcrop, the path, and the whole foreground a little bit more. Just using the flat brush, Payne's Grey and Sepia again, just to darken up in certain areas here and there until I feel that the painting is a bit more balanced. I always see this final part of a painting as sort of a bit of a balancing act. It's where you just have to really look at your painting carefully and just see where it needs a little bit more dark or a little bit more detail. Just a bit more across the base there, under the trees. Just coming in from the tape across that rocky outcrop there. I think we're nearly there now. I think the last thing that I want to do now is to paint in a few more branches with the rigger. Just some finer branches to fill the land across that area around those main trees. Just some sticks and twigs growing out from the undergrowth as well, and just a few more branches. At this stage of the painting, I'm not so much looking at the reference photograph, but looking at the painting as it is at the moment and seeing what I need to do with it. Because this kind of loose painting will sort of take on a life of its own through loose brushwork. And this is where you don't need to constantly be looking at the reference photograph, because now it's time to balance up your painting, and your painting will be unique. It'll be a unique thing and will need maybe some different touches to what you see in the photo in front of you. I'm just putting in a little bit of rigger work with some sticks and twigs on this side, and I think that's just about done. You could, of course, add birds, you could add a boat, or maybe some figures, anything you like really in a painting like this. But I think I'm going to leave it there, and here you see it with the tape removed, and it's got that nice clean white border, and I think it's turned out reasonably well. I'm hoping that I've achieved that rugged, grey, very unique look of an Irish landscape. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. Take care. I'll see you soon. Stay safe and happy painting. Bye.